informal and formal sector for sustainable e-waste management. So I think most of you know the STEP initiative, but for those who don't know it, it's a multi-stakeholder platform where stakeholders, from different sectors all come together, come around one table in order to discuss solutions for electronic waste management on a global level. So we have in the network, we have representatives from the private sector, from academia, from UN organizations, but also from NGOs or from government organizations. We focus really on facilitating communication between our members, facilitate cooperation, and try to implement projects together or research together. And one of the things or one of the papers and working groups that has been going on during the last years was this working groups where we focused on on looking into and analyzing existing partnerships that would support the informal sector, as it is a very important part of the whole recycling chain or e-waste recycling chain within the electronic waste management. How those partnerships look like, what kind of partnerships exist between the formal and informal sector, and really looked into different case studies. There was then a paper developed out of that, and this is what we want to present you to today. So within this webinar, the first presentation will be done by Daniel Hinchliffe from GIZ, who will give you a short introduction about the insights of the paper and what really is in the insights of the paper. And then we will have 3 presentations that go into the case study. So we will have the case study presented from Peru, from Nigeria, and from South Africa. And at the end of all the presentations, we will then have some time for discussion on those examples and also look into the future and how next steps could look like. So with this very short introduction, I would like to hand over now to Daniel and to start the presentation.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Elizabeth. So yeah, I have the pleasure to share with you some insights on the paper that we've developed during the last couple of years within the STEP working group. As GIZ, we had been doing some pilots and a number of activities on this kind of topic between of how to set up partnerships between the formal and the informal e-waste sector in India for a number of years going back, particularly in India. And we saw this as a really great opportunity to kind of bring in some of these insights and look at how it could be applied on a global scale. So I'm working in our advisory project, and we develop different concepts on e-waste. And yeah, I think maybe the best place to start is to kind of just jump right in and say, okay, well, what is the informal sector and what are they doing? And here is an example of e-waste collection in Ghana, and this will then generally be taken to the scrapyard, where an informal dismantling operation takes place before he takes maybe all of the different cables from this dismantling activity to a burning site and then burns them to get the copper out of them. And this is a really important subsistence activity and a way to generate some kind of livelihood for these different actors. And as you've seen, I mean, collection and dismantling is not necessarily the most dangerous activity in the world, but once it comes to getting the value out from these cables and other components, which are containing a lot of hazardous materials, it becomes quite an environmental problem, also a health problem for these people, because as you can see in this picture, it's a lot of toxic smoke coming off of this. So the question is, how can we actually use these valuable parts in e-waste and this existing value chain, and maybe combine this together with formal operations, or upgrade these operations so that they are happening in a safe and environmentally sound way. And here you see a picture from Desco in South Africa, where they are actually dismantling under much safer conditions. And this basically is the topic which we want to handle is, well, how can we bring the informal sector together with the formal sector? And, why do we want to work in this space? Well, if you look at the e-waste recycling worldwide, only 17.4% is being currently collected by formal recycling systems. And the highest share really is being managed in this informal way, which is having huge environmental impacts. And not only this, but also health impacts for these people working in this manner. And you could say, okay, well, I just want to ban all of this informal activity straight up. But this then means that actually they tend to just go further underground. You can burn cables in your garden anywhere and get the copper out. And if you try to just ignore the informal sector, then you basically just set up a parallel system, and you can't get any of the e-waste to actually manage in your formal recycling system because you can't actually pay the same price for it. So if you're setting up extended producer responsibility legislation to get payment into the system, it's important to think about this informal sector activities and how you can integrate them to make it work in a way that's viable for everyone. And as I mentioned, there have been a number of initiatives during the past years looking at the space, how you can set up partnerships. And we really wanted to analyze the literature, look at the different examples that there have been, and figure out if it's possible to develop some recommendations, what are key success factors, and what are interesting case studies actually that could maybe be copied by other contexts. So within that, we had this working group, as Elizabeth mentioned, a number of different organizations within STEP. And over the last couple of years, we developed this paper, which you can download. It's been online for a few months. And super excited to have 3 of the case studies with us today from Peru, Nigeria, and South Africa. So we can really dig a bit deeper and understand exactly how these were set up. But also some other case studies within that paper from Ghana and India, which we can maybe go into at a later point. So who is the informal sector and what kind of possibilities are there for partnerships? Well, essentially it's workers or businesses who are not registered, they're not within kind of a legal contract in some way with the state, they're outside of tax control, they don't have any social or labor market protection provisions. They can be at different stages in the value chain, from collection, sorting, dismantling, through to recycling, but also maybe refurbishment activities. They could be acting as individuals or in a larger group, so they can be quite unorganized or also quite organized. And you can also have larger businesses, which are also, let's say, unofficial businesses, which are also informal. Maybe generating a lot of revenue, but not acting in an environmentally sound way. But you could also have a formal entity, let's say, which has all the registrations and so on, but it's not necessarily acting environmentally friendly. So just because it's informal or formal doesn't necessarily mean that it's environmentally friendly or not. But of course, formal enterprises have to meet different local legislations normally to show that they are doing things in an environmentally sound way. And due to these different parts in the value chain, for collectors, you might need some minimal forms of organization to be a safe activity. Whilst for recycling, burning of cables is obviously not an environmentally friendly thing to do. So you have to figure out, okay, how can you otherwise upgrade this activity or formalize so that it's less damaging? And looking at this from a circular economy kind of view, you can see here a very simplified version for this. Consumer buys from retail at the end of life. Ideally, they take it to a formal take-back system. This is then recycled, and you can use the materials to produce new products. And this costs money for all different e-waste types. Some of them have positive value, of course. You need to finance this. And normally this comes then from the idea, at least in Europe, let's say, of extended producer responsibility legislation, which makes producers cover the costs for the end-of-life management. And if you add in this informal sector equation, you actually have a much higher collection rate because they're very efficient at collecting from different households. But then it's going into informal recycling, burning or dumping. which is a low efficiency process. It's very dangerous. You lose a lot of resources along the way. So the question with these partnerships is really how can we set up a way to kind of connect these formal take-back systems to informal collection. And this is where the idea of incentives come in, but also other different activities to kind of link these two together and block out this, this pathway to the low efficiency dangerous activities. So within this paper, we've been looking at a number of different models. How can you partner? It's very dependent on the local contexts and to what your options might be. We have 5 case studies in the paper, and in 2 of these, there's an extended producer responsibility mechanism in place. So there's a legislation and some sort of financing on its way. And this normally results then in having a producer responsibility organization in the country who facilitates the kind of end-of-life management activities for a producer. So they are in a position to facilitate figuring out, okay, do we want to collect from businesses or households, or do we also want to collect from informal collectors or associations? And they could then potentially also manage the financing to bring this to a formal recycler. And we see this, I think, a bit later with the example from Peru. And if you see this diagram on the right-hand side, this is the schematic for some models in India, where they also have a legislation in place. A consumer buys the product, some money is going to the producer for recycling. This recycler then pays it back to the recycling system. And these actors, producer responsibility organizations or NGOs, can act as a kind of interface agency to connect the informal collectors to a formal recycler. Then we have the other case where we will see later in Nigeria and South Africa, there's no existing functioning legislation yet for financing this, but the recyclers have taken their own initiative to reach out to informal collectors and cooperate with them. And this is another way you can engage and derive benefits from this cooperation. As I mentioned before, one of the major issues here is that the informal sector is much more cost effective than formal sector, and this is why we need the financing. So if you look at the case of mobile phones in India, this I think was some research done 4 years ago. You can see in blue the price that you can get as an informal collector from the informal recycler is much, much higher than the price that a formal recycler can pay you for this, just because the informal sector is externalizing all of their costs on health, on environment, and taxes and standards and so on. So to get successful collaboration here to go forward, you have to also find a way to overcome this price gap. And in the long term, this then means that there's some kind of legislation in place. And this then maybe means that producers are going to pay for these corporations to take place over a longer time period. But if this is not there, then you maybe have to look at doing, as I said before, outreach via recyclers or voluntary producer initiatives where producers say we're prepared to maybe pay for this kind of activity to take place. And this was what we saw in some of the pilots in India in the past. They did not, were not able to sustain themselves beyond the kind of donor funding unless a producer was on board who was prepared to pay a little bit longer. But essentially it comes down to finding out some kind of incentive to sustain these partnerships. So on the one hand, you have financial incentives. This can be paying the market price. It could also be saying, you know, in times like now, coronavirus is really hitting the market. We'd still give you a minimum price, but we also, and this can be attractive then for informal collectors. Or it could be to say we give you a fixed salary, so that maybe it's on the whole a lower salary than you might be able to get, but it's more reliable, particularly for moments like now when the market drops due to the market price drops because of the volatility that's there from an economic crash or something like this. Financial incentives are not on their own enough to actually set up a partnership. We saw in the paper there are some examples in Colombia where drug cartels are buying all of these printed circuit boards for a much higher price and sending them to Europe, so they're able to do money laundering with these. On the other hand, in Ghana, as soon as there was a price incentive being offered by GIZ for some refrigerators, everybody started thinking that there was gold inside of these and didn't want to give up any refrigerators anymore. So you really have to do some kind of awareness raising and maybe set prices together with the informal sector to ensure some sort of transparency is there. And this is where the non-financial incentives come in. It's really important to have trust building there, and you can develop this through trainings and support organizations to set themselves up and advocate for workers' rights. You can have ID cards, or just to prove that people are actually doing an activity which is valid and verified. They can have a certificate they can show to authorities or police if they are being stopped or something like this. You can also take care of tax issues, PPE, so protective gear, but also educational services and maybe also health insurance. One of the great things at the moment is that it's possible to also use some new opportunities with digital payments. There's been a few pilots on this, and the advantage of these is that they can maybe cut out the risks of having cash transactions with middlemen. You can also track the flow of cash versus material, and reduce the risk of corruption and bribes, and also go into tax compliance. There are sometimes transaction fees, but at the same time, because you have access to international markets due to digital aspects, let's say, you can also maybe get better pricing sometimes for your material rather than just being dependent on the guy who says, I give you $10 for this right here, right now. And for an example of this, GIZ e-waste program in Ghana just released this report last month, I think it went online. And here you can see that they brought the cables to the collection center, got paid then in mobile money after there was a weighing. And these pictures were then kind of brought into the digital system to make sure that there was no double counting. And on the right, you see a awareness raising poster of how to kind of engage on the scrapyard with this. So there are a number of challenges that need to be overcome. One is, of course, trust. If you're a big producer, you're not necessarily active with informal sector. So you have to find a way to approach them. And this can be the role that an interface agency or a PRO or NGO can take over. And once this is then set up, you can start to develop a common approach. There's often a lack of information on how the informal structures are operating. And there's often, maybe as a formal recycler or producer, you want to have a regular supply, but this is maybe also something that informal stakeholders can't guarantee. So this is also a challenge. As I mentioned before, if there's no producer who's willing to say, I'm in for the long term and I will guarantee a price payment, then this can definitely be an issue if there's no legislation, which is kind of forcing them to do this. And sometimes legal texts, so if the legislation or the authorities are not thinking about this issue of how to integrate the informal sector, you could end up with a kind of local legal situation which doesn't take such partnerships into account, which obviously makes your activities much more difficult. So the benefits really are many for different stakeholders. For producers, it gives you a chance to comply with recycling targets because you can get hold of more e-waste from these informal collection channels. You can also achieve your corporate social responsibility goals. Authorities have the chance to meet employment promotion objectives at the same time as maybe reducing their enforcement administrative efforts and pollution. The recyclers have a chance to get more material, which helps them in turn to get higher efficiencies of scale for their investments and technologies. but also to understand the local market conditions better, which maybe gives them a competitive advantage and they can avoid cherry picking. So maybe more components or more e-waste, which has not had the most valuable points or components taken out of it if they're cooperating with informal sector. And for the informal sector, of course, they are able to gain visibility and avoid being marginalized, and maybe avoid some of the health risks, get some work protections, and in some cases also set up businesses and raise more revenue by avoiding the middleman. So I don't want to go on too much longer because we have some really interesting case studies here, but I would urge, I think, to also have a look at the paper. But in terms of recommendations for producers and producer responsibility organizations, it's really important to understand the local context and then to kind of engage with local stakeholders. And you can see here on the right, this is one of the PROs in India engaging with workers from an NGO in Patna, and just to kind of understand what their issues are and how they can develop something together. Producers and PROs can, if they have an extended producer responsibility plan obligation, they can try to make it inclusive. So make sure that the informal sector is also included and not just with formal recyclers, let's say. They can offer simple mechanisms to register with them or to report. They can provide long-term support to informal workers with trainings or give them their price guarantees. And if they are choosing recyclers, then maybe they can select the ones which are looking to do inclusive recycling with the informal sector as their partners. Authorities have a big role to play. They can actually, say that they prefer these kind of inclusive recycling strategies and leave room in transitional phases for these to be set up and give time for stakeholders to formalize or to organize themselves, particularly in the informal sector. They can support these kind of partnerships through dialogue and facilitation, and also set out clear procedures or guidance for monitoring reports. One other thing they can do is maybe give them, easier access to authorizations or tenders as well. These kind of partnerships if they want to support inclusive recycling. For the informal sector, of course, they need to be prepared to enter minimum forms of organization. This means also meeting minimal forms of reporting and transparency. And I think transparency can go both ways. So, I mean, there have been cases where informal sector has tried to exploit new periods in the rules for e-waste in India, for instance. They knew that the producers and PROs needed to collect more waste at a certain time, so they started to inflate their prices. And if you have this kind of trust built up over a longer time period, then you can maybe avoid this. And I think that this is where one area where you can definitely see that the transparency is needed on both sides. On the one hand, producers and PROs shouldn't exploit the marginalized status of the informal sector. And on the other hand, the informal sector needs to be transparent about the prices that they have. And essentially, you're looking to kind of actually set up some kind of paid collection service with them and not just pay for the materials. And yeah, finally, of course, they should also really focus on the activities which are safer. And if they're not safe, like these recycling techniques, which I mentioned earlier, then here it's really the question of how do they formalize this or upgrade themselves? Or do they have to just focus on different activities which are not so dangerous? And recyclers, they can also take on reliable reporting measures. They can contract informal collectors into their operations, provide ID cards, register them, get them recognized. And they can also promote this idea of these partnerships and why this is an important part of their business model to authorities and to producers and producer responsibility organizations. But I think we would get a much better idea of all these different points in the case studies, which are about to follow. And I think for me today, it would be really interesting to discuss with the participants in the call as well. I mean, I've touched on a number of different insights here. So just an introduction to the paper. Later on, it could be interesting to discuss, is it interesting to go into more detail on different aspects like incentive mechanisms? What other examples do you have from different countries of different partnerships which are working well or maybe not so well? and how else can we support the uptake of these kind of partnerships into different legislations and initiatives. So I think with that, we can maybe pass on to Daniel Ott from Peru, unless there are any direct questions for understanding. And yeah, thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Daniel, for the first presentation, and also for already putting some questions at the end. So I think this is really something that we can then take up again at the end of all the presentations and have then them as guiding questions for the discussion. So Daniel, you already started sharing your screen, so please take over.
Hello, everyone. This is Daniel Ott. I'm the manager Latin America with the Reverse Logistics Group. Before we jump into the case about Peru, I'd like to really quickly explain to you who we are and what we do. So Reverse Logistics Group is a integrator of reverse logistics systems around the globe. In Latin America, we mainly focus on electronics management and take back. And you can also see here on the screen that our main two pillars are basically what we call the mandatory group plans or the compliance schemes, compliance services that we provide to our customers, which are mainly from the OEM side, original equipment manufacturers, and also voluntary take-back programs that are not, let's say, based on any regulation, but products from our customers that require a take-back service of any kind. So whenever we can, we actually try to combine these two. So we try to use everything that we collect for compliance. And this has led us also based on the different laws and regulations that you have in Latin America. This has led us to this footprint that you can see on the slide. We're currently active in 8 countries around the region. We have set up local entities in 5 of them, Mexico, Colombia, and that's where I'm sitting today, Peru, Chile, and Argentina. So if we zoom into Peru, and you can also see it here on the screen, we have what we call a group plan, which is basically a compliance scheme or a producer responsibility organization, how it's called in the paper. We started back in 2014 when the regulation came out with 4 producers. Now we have a group together of over 30 producers. You can also see on the screen here that we had to grow our collection extensively, or that we grew our collection extensively over the last 6 years. But this is basically mandated by the mandatory collection targets that we face to keep, let's say, our producers in compliance. So over the last 6 years, we've performed over let's say 1,500 collection requests, coming up to a total of almost 4,500 tons collected. For European measures, for people in the US, that might feel probably like a small quantity, but let me assure you that that's the most that any formal organization has collected for compliance in Peru over the last years. So for a country like Peru, this is actually quite a volume. Which has kept us then 100% in compliance with the different regulations. Here on the other side of the slide, just quickly, and that's also when then our collaboration with Emaús Trujillo comes in, where we collect. So we have tried to expand our reach to different areas of the country. Peru is a very highly centralized country around Lima that you can see down here. A third of the population is living there, and almost every business or any business moves through Lima somehow. So it is a challenge in a country like Peru to have a spread like we can show it here on the screen. This is just a snapshot of the categories, how we've collected them over the last few years. This is very likely to change because at the beginning, the regulation only focused on ICT and consumer electronics, while now also large and small household appliances are coming into obligation. Just so you know, Trujillo, that's a city in the north of Peru, so that's up here more or less. And now let me just focus very quickly on how we operate our group plan before I then come to the details around our collaboration with Emmaus Trujillo. This is a very schematic overview of how we're set up. We're in the middle, as I said, integrating the system and the relationship between the producers, the generators, the collectors and collection sites, and the we recyclers. We collect from different sources, have implemented different type of collection mechanisms over the years. Obviously, one service that we have is what we call internal volumes, so what we collect directly from the OEMs, but then also what we collect from their different type of customers. So we have, this can be institutions, let's say private companies or public entities, but obviously also households with the end consumer. So for the end consumer, these have basically, been the most difficult strategies to develop, and we've put up over the years a network of collection sites, which we call our own collection sites, but then we've also developed alliances and partnerships with municipalities, and in some cases also with collectors. So as you can see on the screen, with the steep growth of volumes, pressure has risen over the years to be more creative, to go further, to being able to collect these materials. And this has led us to collaborate with an association which is called Traperos Emmaus Trujillo, which was founded in 1996 with the support of Emmaus Peru and two Emmaus organizations from the Netherlands and Spain. And Emmaus is part of the international solidarity movement, Emmaus International, which goes back to the 1940s when Abbé Pierre founded this in France. So as you can see already from this first paragraph, this is obviously Emmaus Trujillo is a formal structure, but they are a very important interface to the informal sector. So basically, the relation to the informal sector is twofold. On one hand, they collect recyclable materials through waste pickers, as you can say, and also start integrating waste pickers into their operation, offering them, let's say, a way into a more formal setup, also reintegrating them into society, if you want to call it that way. And on the other hand, and I will come to that later as well, we're basically rerouting material that was previously going to the informal sector now into a formal recycling structure. So, as I said, Emmaus is in charge of collecting a lot of type of wastes from different type of generators. And that's how over the years they have obviously come in contact with electronic waste. That was not their focus at the beginning, but by just collecting recyclable waste from different generators, they also started taking back electronic waste or electronic products. So how did it all start? For that, I have to quickly go back to 2008 because the setting up a we management system in Peru actually goes back to that date when a multi-stakeholder roundtable led by the Minister of Environment and supported by Swiss cooperation around SECO and EMPA was created. The SECO-EMPA project had a very important role, let's say, over these years to move the e-waste topic forward in Peru. And around this multi-stakeholder roundtable, the e-waste legislation that we are implementing today as a producer responsibility organization was developed and created. As I said, Emmaus at that time was collecting e-waste through their daily activities. And when they found out about the roundtable, their representatives started to join the roundtable, and over the years, they and the years of participation, basically they got educated about the different aspects of e-waste, and they also found out that what they were doing at that time, which was just collecting the material and then selling it back to the informal sector, was probably not the right thing to do. So at an e-waste event, in 2014, we first met the representatives of MAUs at Trujillo and started to discuss if there was a possible way to collaborate and basically reroute these volumes that were going into back, after almost a formal collection, going back to the informal sector. First pickup finally happened in 2016. So it has been a very interesting 5 years of collaborations. Over these 5 years, we have prevented 586 tons from being recycled informally, or that's what we have taken back through MAUs. If we think back to the number that I showed you of about 4,500 tons collected as a PRO, then that's more than 10% of our collection, which is obviously quite an important volume for us. So this alliance has really paid off for us and hopefully for both of us. I come to that a little bit later. And also important, this has allowed us to reach out basically into 7 provinces, which are in the north of Peru, which, we didn't have a way of getting there by ourselves, or let's say only with quite high costs. So how does the model work? This is actually the illustration that you also have in the paper. MAUs offers different type of services to different type of generators. You have a door-to-door pickup activity, but they also have business pickup activities where they pick up directly from larger generators, industries, supermarkets, and these kind of alliances that they have. What's really valuable to us is their let's say aggregation or storage and collection points where they hold on to the material until we have a volume large enough to being transported to Lima. Why are we transporting to Lima? That's basically because in the entire, and I mentioned it before, with Peru being very centralized, that also happens to the e-waste recyclers. So the only e-waste recyclers that basically, let's say, pass certain standards or pass the audits of us as a producer responsibility organization, but also of our customers, which are the OEMs, are located in Lima. So this makes it obviously more difficult because we have to bring almost all of the material to Lima, and so that's a very good structure to ensure that we don't have extremely high costs. As also mentioned by Daniel in his presentation, what we pay in this case is a collection fee. We deliberately distinguish that from buying the material because there's really a collection effort behind it. If you want to interpret it as we're buying the material, then that's fine. But we really make emphasis, let's say, in the collection fee as such. We are paying MAUs Trujillo for their work around collecting the material, storing it, and then have it ready for pickup by our logistics partners. We then bring the material to the recycler, and then there's obviously, auditing by the government. We use the material for compliance, so there's a documentation around it, that's what allows us then to use this material for compliance of our member companies, which are the producers. So if I already jump to the lessons learned, I think this collaboration is a very good example of a win-win situation. So we are getting volumes and regional coverage while creating also on the side environmental and social benefits. So we're avoiding material going the wrong way, let's say. And on the other hand, we're supporting an organization that has clearly a clear social impact on their workers and Emmaus is getting a steady guaranteed income while gaining market and reputation. Let me quickly elaborate on that. So on one hand, our agreement is that we will take any material collected and all of the material. So that is important to them. And obviously, because we are able to provide them with the full documentation, the full transparency, the certificates, and also the permits, let's say, by the government, they have been able to grow their network, to get more generators on board, because as regulation is developed and as formal companies are requesting more and more documentation for the disposal of these type of wastes, they also have to respond to this to be able to stay in the market. And obviously this has helped them as well to gain reputation by being able to provide these certificates to the end consumer, or even to their industry generators. But, and that's a big emphasis here on the but, this would not be possible if there weren't MAU's belief in doing the right thing. We know that prices in the informal sector today, they're still much higher. So it would be easy for them to just go for for maximizing the economic benefit and selling it back to the informal sector. But they're convinced that this is more sustainable in the long run, that there are multiple benefits to them, and that's why this collaboration has worked out fine over the last few years. So we have contracts in place, but there's nothing really preventing them from just walking away and selling the material back to the informal sector. So trust is an important base for such collaboration, and that's also the reason why we haven't been able to, let's say, replicate this model with other MAU's organizations or other similar organizations in the country. There's different local MAU's organizations in Lima, in the south of the country, and it has not been possible to do something similar with them because we never found, on one hand, they prefer selling the material back to the informal sector. On the other hand, we've never been able to establish this kind of trust as we were, with MAU's in Trujillo. So for us as a producer responsibility organization, it's really important that we have this formal, let's say, interface in the form of MAUs that we can collaborate with. It's very difficult to collaborate directly with, let's say, informal collectors, but this has been, very interesting and from our view, successful over the last few years. We're constantly working on adjustments of the current model also to keep it attractive for MAUs. We're thinking about new type of additions to the program, some kind of reward system. We have to look into that a little bit more in detail before it's ready, but we really want to keep this as much as we can and keep expanding it, and also offer them a way of regionally expanding. When we first started, they were only doing this in Trujillo, and now they have expanded their reach into seven provinces in the north as well. So all of all, as I said, a win-win, somehow fragile, but it has been working well, and 5 years I think is quite some time. So we're looking forward to hopefully much more than another 5 years. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I give back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Daniel, for this presentation. I will directly hand over to Adrian, as time has passed by already quite a lot. So Adrian, you should be able, Adrian, you should be able to share your screen now. Perfect. So we can see your screen and you can just jump into your presentation. But Adrian, you're still muted, so you should unmute yourself so we can hear you.
Oh yes, that's better. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adrian, so I will be presenting on behalf of Hinckley Group today. I'm going to start with a little bit of background. Some of you may have seen some of these slides before in some of my other meetings. We've been doing quite a lot of online webinars since the lockdown, but bear with me. There is some new content and some old content here mixed in. So Hinkley's been in Nigeria since 1998. We have been an ICT solutions provider since then. We became a HP authorized service center in 2001. But we started getting into recycling. Well, we started the discussion back in 2011 with HP, as we're a HP service center, and we were asking them what we're going to do with the end-of-life HP equipment, and that led to a lot of work and 6 years of effort, and we finally opened a recycling facility for e-waste in Nigeria. We were the first government-approved e-waste facility. So we do a lot of work with OEMs. We equally do a lot of work with the some of the large enterprise businesses in Nigeria as well. So a good portion of our material comes from these formal relationships, which we have in place. That kind of is the bread and butter for the business. That's how we generate our revenue. We are also a Global Challenge Leap winner. Sorry. Yeah, there we go. We're also a Global Leap Challenge winner. That was last year. For those of you that don't know this program, it's a solely e-waste focused challenge. We're looking at the processing and management of end-of-life lithium-ion batteries from solar solutions. So this is really a great outcome for us. So looking at Nigeria now, Nigeria is one of the most populous countries in Africa, and equally what goes with that is one of the highest e-waste generation rates in Africa, 277 metric kilotons per annum, which is considerably more than their neighbors Ghana and other countries in West Africa. There are a number of dump sites in Lagos. This is just looking at Lagos right now. These are identified by the Oko Institute. These are the 7 that they identified. There are more, but these are probably the largest ones. This is one of the Lagos Waste Management Authority landfill sites. There's 8 of these in Lagos. Some have now been completely shut down. Some are still active. But as you can see, they're not particularly well managed in the sense that it's not a traditional landfill site as you would expect and elsewhere. So this is going back a couple of years now, but one of the largest sites in Lagos sadly set on fire, and that caused a great deal of pollution and toxic fumes within the area. And unfortunately, there are schools and residential area within this proximity. So we have gone around, obviously since 2011, we had a great deal of interest in how e-waste is processed in the country. And, over the past years, we've been looking at different locations. This is one of the dump sites in Ogun State, where they are collecting and aggregating a number of different waste streams, not just electronics. Obviously, the same individuals will be collecting electronics, but also cans, for example, as you can see here. This is a lot of informal activity, although this is to some extent, a state-operated dump site, which has been watched over by the Ministry of Environment in Ogun State. There are sporadic, informal dump sites all over the state, if I'm honest with you. Even in some of the highbrow areas like Victoria Island, you see open burning of cables, although somewhat hidden these days, but nevertheless it still takes place. And you find these locations, again, a mixture of e-waste, but scrap metal, plastic bottles being collected. This is another one of the informal recycling sites. This is what we call New Garage. It's in an area of Lagos called Ojota. And the interesting thing about this location is although we call them informal, they're very organized and in their operation, just very informal on how they handle the waste material with very lack of regard for health and safety. So here we can see a set of scales in the middle picture, and then they're kind of outdoor storage facilities for some of the materials. The surprising thing about this is that if you look at the Google map here, our formal facility is close by, but they will receive a great higher tonnage of material than we will, and for sure. I mean, we see a very small fraction of the e-waste in the country, probably less than 1%, of the volume. Majority of it is going to locations like this. Obviously, this is quite a small site, but there are many of them spread out across the state. And sadly, also, you can note that there is a school nearby as well, and it is quite residential, it's quite built up. This is the same location. This is the photographs taken from the same place where we saw those scales. So they are also doing open smelting here as well. So this is a few photographs of that and some of the ingots that they've collected there as well. A little bit higher up the food chain, this is some of the wholesalers collecting and buying large volumes of high value material, possibly not the mobile phone batteries, but the mobile phones certainly. So yeah, so this is an area called Computer Village, again in Lagos. So looking into some of the detail of income for the informal sector in Nigeria, you have door-to-door collectors earning, in the region of on average, $2 to $3 per day. And then that's set the more formal, informal, and then obviously on the lower tier, the freely available waste off the street, the kind of street pickers earning less than that. Looking at the refurbishers, these are the guys such as that location I just showed you, Computer Village, where they're doing the repair work with a healthier income, but by no means healthy. There are e-waste legislation in place in Nigeria. Since 2011, they have had the national environmental regulations in place. And since 2017, they have had EPR guidelines in place. Enforcement is active. This is only last year. There was an Asian gang operating in Lagos who were buying large volumes of PCBs. Preparing them for export back to Asia. But we do believe there are more groups such as these operating currently. So quickly looking at where some of these materials coming in from, a large volume of the e-waste is still coming in through used electrical equipment. It's coming through the ports, undeclared, often in vehicles, roll-off vehicles. There's a very interesting study conducted by UNU in Basel into this, and they actually had representatives in the ports monitoring what was taking place there. So you can see the picture here, a photocopy in the back of a vehicle, and it is only the vehicle that's obviously been declared the contents. A lot of that e-waste is coming in from Germany, UK, Belgium, Netherlands, Spain, etc. As I say, in these roll-on, roll-off vehicles, much more than in containers, which was surprising for me. And most of it, as I say, is undeclared. 66.5% of that is undeclared as e-waste. And it really is more often than not already e-waste when it arrives. It will come in as functioning electronics. It may serve the purpose for a short period of time before it ends up in the refurbisher workshops getting repaired, before it finally goes into the dump sites and or already picked from the refurbishers by informal collectors prior to export. So Hinckley, really, we've been particularly focused on that informal sector and how we can. We know that a business model of operating purely with responsible enterprise companies is not sustainable for the country. We need to try and tackle and solve the e-waste problem in Nigeria, and we can only do that by working with the informal sector. 99% of this e-waste is going to go through the informal sector currently, and not to a formal recycler like Hinckley. So we set up an organization called the E-Waste Collectors Association of Nigeria a couple of years ago, and the main objective of this was for us as an organization to better understand the informal sector, and learn how we can work with them in a manner that primarily safeguards the environment from hazardous e-waste fractions. But obviously we're all sitting here today trying to understand and disseminate all the information, so it is highly complex, and that's one of the outcomes of setting up this organization, working for the informal sector. We have various challenges which I will share. So what we did with the informal sector was the first step was to obviously get their information, name, phone number, address, next of kin, a kind of KYC process. And then the next stage was to help them if they didn't already set up a bank account. So more often than not, they didn't have what they call a Nigeria BVN number, which is required to have a bank account. Quite a simple process to do it, but some of the guys are illiterate or just have basic challenges getting that done. And for the sake of transparency, it's very important that any funds paid to them go directly into a bank account through a mobile transfer more often than not. Although there are other models such as in Kenya, like the M-Pesa model, which are very interesting. I think in Ghana as well, they're using mobile money. And the other part is obviously auditing them, making sure that anybody that we work with in the association are of age, not obviously trying to eliminate child labor, which is still prevalent within the informal collection sector in Nigeria, sadly. And equally looking at where do they get the material from. Hopefully, we try and ensure as much as possible that it's not stolen, for example, and then also where are they collecting, where are they piling up the material before they bring it. So yeah, I think I've covered most of those steps. I think the only other thing here to mention is one of the things we're trying to do, and part of that trust. I think the previous presenter was discussing that trust is very important, and one ways that we're trying to achieve that is through, apart from just giving cash, is to look at their well-being and try and take care of that as well. Things like pension or HMOs are really powerful tools. We haven't implemented those, but that's something we want to implement because it goes beyond just cash in hand. It's about creating a sustainable model that protects their health, and when they're too old to collect the stuff, that they have something to fall back on, and then obviously immediately taking care of their day-to-day needs now. So this is the diagram that for our case study that's in the paper. So yep, couldn't have created it better myself, so why not copy and paste it? So thank you very much, Daniel and Elizabeth. So yeah, I think this summarizes the system that we are currently using in Nigeria. But it comes with its challenges, and these challenges currently are unsurmountable, and it's really putting the brakes on most of the activity. Even with all these systems in place that you can see here, we're still not getting material as we should be, and that comes down to a simple problem of incentives. These are just a few photographs of some of the programs that we did with the collectors within the association. We do a lot of training programs, medical checkups, but from Hinckley's perspective, actually the best part about these, apart from giving them PPE training, medical checkups, is just purely to talk to them, sit down, learn from them, understand how they operate, where they operate, and understand what motivates them. So it's been a really kind of great learning process for Hinckley as well. But as I mentioned, when we sit down with these guys, of course, we're talking about incentives and material, and how do we incentivize these guys to get the material from them? How do we stop them from selling it to the informal sector, like some of those guys we saw earlier on being arrested? How do we stop that process? And that's really the biggest challenge that we still face even today. We haven't overcome that. I mean, these are some fractions that were purchased just yesterday. Where I wanted to share some of the prices that we're buying these materials from the informal sector, from some of the collectors. So you have on the left, you have the scrap material description, memory boards, different grade boards, some from phones, laptops, or TVs, the price in which we're purchasing it at from the informal sector, and then the value from European buyers, smelters and treatment facilities in Europe who have shared their price list with us, and how much they would pay us, although the price is obviously in tons, not kg. But anyway, so that there is quite a big disparity between what we could buy it for and what we could get back if we sent it responsibly in line with all the Basel requirements, and ensuring that the hazardous fractions were treated properly. Bearing all that in mind, we're still going to make less money per kg for these different material types. So that's the challenge. It's pretty obvious, and it's obviously, Daniel, you obviously mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of reasons for this and why this is happening. I think later on I'll share a few of those challenges with you, but that in itself is the problem in a nutshell, and that's why we're not seeing the material. So just to touch on what was done in Ghana, I don't want to go into too much because that's not my case study, but I just thought it was really interesting on the program that they set up there, working with the collectors and Greenad setting up the collection centers within the dump sites, and then having a formal recycler, City Waste, actually processing those cables and doing the separation. So what we did there, obviously, you probably have seen this, most of you, but that they came up with the pricing modality, so based on the LME value of the copper content of the various cables. And it was really interesting to see how the different cables actually all had really different values, and you could really easily make mistakes on that. So even something as simple as a cable, you have to also be very careful on the different cable types and how much they're going to be worth by the time you've processed them. And here you can see that they've added a service fee to the collectors as well to incentivize them to bring it to this formal process which they set up. And the net compensation per pound in is it Ghanaian shillings, I think they're called, the lower limit at 4 Ghanaian shillings, and then upper limit of 6.70. So they shifted the range depending on how much volume they were getting. And as you can see, depending on that incentive rate, the volumes really fluctuated. So as the incentive increased, as you go across the chart on the x-axis, you can see the tonnage increasing quite substantially as they increase that incentive to the collection network. So, and again, looking at India, this is in the paper as well. Looking at the darker grey is the informal prices in rupees per kg, and then the lighter grey is the formal price in rupees. So for the same material, there's quite a substantial difference between the value in the formal versus the informal sectors. So what's the solution? Obviously, it's EPR systems are needed, much needed in Nigeria. Already been a great deal of discussion taking place in Nigeria on this. There's already a producer responsibility organization set up in Nigeria called EPRON, and they're working closely with UNEP and NESREA. NESREA is the enforcement agency representing the Ministry of Environment for Nigeria, and Jeff are funding the current startup of this EPR system in Nigeria. So it is at quite an interesting point in time, also HB Dell and Philips have been involved. That HB Dell and Philips have formed an alliance. They operate in various countries across the world, I believe, collectively to support these systems to ensure that there's a better management of electrical waste.
Sorry, Adrian, just because we are running out of time, How many slides do you still have? Because otherwise we have to move to the next presenter.
Yeah, just a couple more.
Just okay, just to maybe wrap up so we can have enough time also for the discussion.
Sure. So apart from EPR, as we're waiting for the EPR to be implemented, Hinkley and closing the loop were the first companies to export hazardous mobile phone batteries out of the country in line with the Basel Convention. So this is also a really interesting project, which I would advise anybody who has the time to have a look at. But this also uses an incentive system to get the material from the informal sector, and then through Hinkley and closing the loop, we were able to export it to a formal treatment plant in Belgium. Currently, we're doing a lot of capacity building, bringing in equipment to further process some of the materials, some of the hazardous fractions, and that's really important to us over the next few years. So some of the big challenges that, just to touch on this, obviously there's no EPR in place currently. There's a lot of inflation in the scrap material prices. This possibly could be also to do with money laundering. I can't confirm that. Limited control of import of UEE. Standards and enforcement still need to be improved. There's a lack of downstream treatment facilities, although, as I mentioned, Hinkley is working on that. Very complex and extensive process to export hazardous fractions out of the country, and also inadequate health support for some of these informal collectors. And quite frankly, a lot of the time, there's just bigger challenges than the environment, and it's not always a priority, whether it be for large organizations that operate there, for the government, or for the informal collectors themselves. Protecting the environment is not always the priority. So thank you very much for your time. I'll back over to you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Adrian, and sorry for cutting you short. So I would like to ask Julio now to present the case of South Africa. Do you also have some slides? So I make you presenter, so just in case you want to share something.
Oh, I have 2 slides in case.
Okay. Then I make you presenter, Daniel.
Elizabeth, can I chat?
Yes, sure. We can hear you, and Daniel can share the slides.
Oh, can you guys see my screen right now?
So Daniel or Julio, who wants to share the screen?
You have slides, Julio?
I do. I'll just flick through my laptop because I don't have proper slides, but I'll just talk about what I do have, what you have, and then we can ask questions afterwards. I won't be too long.
Sure. Then,
okay.
Make Julio the presenter.
Yes, so he is. Do you know how to share your screen? Yeah, it's coming up. Perfect.
Okay, great, cool. Okay, well, hello, thank you very much for having me. I'm Julio from Desco. I just want to quickly run through who we are. I'll be very quick, and essentially what we've done on our informal side. So essentially, Desco Electronic Recyclers, we are 28 years in business, and we started our first informal project in the year 2000. So we started it a while ago and then picked up with a few new projects about 3 years ago again, and we went up to about 10 companies concurrently that we were trying to help. So essentially what we do is we do collection of e-waste recycling, we do ITAD and refurbishment, and we do essentially certified data destruction. We offer all those services on-site and off-site as well. Currently, Desco is one of the largest recyclers in Africa. So with our experience, we've managed to empower a lot of companies in South Africa to be completely sustainable on their own. They are at part 2, sorting and dismantling, and currently Desco is pre-processing for metals recovery. So we're just now exporting overseas to Europe, to the foundries, and they essentially take the precious metals out of the circuit boards. But we're currently investing in technology to do that all locally and offer a one-stop solution in South Africa. That's just our data destruction. These are our certificates essentially, and I'll refer to this a bit later, but we actually allow some of the subcontractors to piggyback off us when they have their own clients they essentially set up a contract, or we have a contract in place to subcontractor or this informal recycler who's informal as a joint venture with Desco, and electronic waste will be recycled responsibly because all the and sorted into its different waste streams will go to a fully compliant electronic recycler. These are our synergy partners at the moment. So the good thing, one of the positive things about having these informal recyclers that we've actually uplifted to become formalized is that we are currently in one province in South Africa, and it's difficult for us to service other provinces or other regions or states. Expensive for us to collect, but our customers that have branches, demand. And so the benefit of actually uplifting these guys is that they can start to purchase their own transport and travel, and because they have much less overheads, it's actually more economically viable for them to collect, dismantle, and then sell the fractions back to us at a much higher rate, actually, which is great. And yes, if you need to get hold of us, those are our details over there. This is the setup that Daniel essentially did for us, which is very, very good, and I do appreciate it. I've used it in a couple of my presentations so far, so I quite like it. Thank you very much, Daniel. Just to talk about where we essentially started and what we do with our informal guys. Either the subcontractor, like we like to call them, they were existing customers. So they were informal, they would go and source electronic waste, they would then come to Desco and sell only a few of the fractions here. Once we would notice that they were starting to do well, they would collect a lot of e-waste and essentially bring in high volumes, they would either approach us or we would approach them to say, look, we will cover some of your overheads, help you become essentially more legalized, more formalized, essentially. We'll help you with your tax structures, we'll help you with your compliance, and you can be a subcontractor to us. And that way, instead of sourcing your own material, you can still do that, but we will provide you with processed e-waste. And this also applies to some of our employees that have been working with us for 10 years, because what they do is they learn the business quite well, and they see that there is an opportunity to start their own businesses, and we encourage them to do that. And they take the knowledge, what they've learned at Desco, and they start their own e-waste companies, either in different regions, like let's say Cape Town or KZN or whatever like that. And yeah, they take what they learned from us and they start a business elsewhere. And an additional income as well that we provide them with is like a labor fee. So what will happen is, okay, let me just also look at the design here. So essentially what happens is the processed e-waste will come into Desco. We source that from our own clients. If the data is confidential, right, like the electronics cannot leave our premises, we actually outsource some of our labor to these subcontractors so that they can have an additional income. They can learn how to, we can train them essentially, they can learn how to dismantle different fractions and get a labor fee from us. The other income or primary income that they have is when we have general electronics come in, where it's IT, electronics, we give them something called pre-processed e-waste. So if, let's say, printers come in, we first take out the toner and cartridges, and then we give them the printer. That way we know that 100% of the printer is recycled. There's no items or hazardous items that get dumped elsewhere. So all that e-waste gets taken to their offsite location. The only thing that we want back from them is the circuit boards, because that is our main income. We have a mechanical plant on site to recycle circuit boards and ship them overseas, and they extract the precious metals from it. All the other fractions like your ferrous metals, your cable, plastics, there are other local recycling that we actually provide ourselves. And we rather encourage them, look, don't sell all your fractions to us, but rather go to them and get a higher income and use that money to essentially grow. So that is essentially the structure that we have. We do training on site. We try and uplift them because, again, in South Africa, we have something called BEE, which is Black Economical Empowerment. So it is a project to essentially uplift previously disadvantaged groups. So we can actually use that as a benefit on our BEE scorecard, and that essentially helps, but it helps our company, which is quite nice. So some of the benefits that we give these informal recyclers is the training. We give them PPE at cost, or sometimes if it's secondhand PPE, we give it to them for free. We give them secondhand tools. We deliver the electronic waste to their facility free of charge. Our accountants help them with the admin work, to help them get legal, essentially, to get a tax structure in place, to get the minimum requirements of, let's say, certificates and whatnot. So that is essentially how we help them out. I just want to run through some of the issues that we obviously have encountered, which everybody else has touched on before, is they were burning cable, they were dumping, and the problem that we ran into, we had 10 e-waste recyclers at one time that we were trying to uplift, selling processed e-waste to. But what was happening was they were actually selling, the one deal was, we were supposed to sell all the commodities, sorry, the circuit boards back to Desco. That was the deal. You could sell all the fractions anywhere else, but definitely sell the circuit boards back to us, and that's why we would provide you with e-waste. But then we found out that obviously they were selling to our competition, which wasn't part of the deal. So we would at least give them the first warning to say, you can't do this, please don't do this, go through the formalities, give them another chance. But some people just continue to do it. They would at least maybe sell half the material back to us and half to someone else. But it's very easy to spot that. So officially we are down to 4 informal recyclers now that we have essentially brought to be formalized. They are self-sufficient. We still provide them with e-waste, and especially with this coronavirus that has come out now, they are now heavily reliant on Desco providing them processed e-waste. Before they had their own clients, but even with us, we've noticed that there's been a massive drop in collections because everybody's holding on to their own products. So we still do yet. We have bin projects all over the country where people can essentially put their e-waste and we collect from them, have bins at customer sites and schools. So we have an income stream of e-waste, and then that essentially goes to these formalized recyclers, and they can at least keep busy and keep their employees working. As everybody else has also mentioned, it definitely works on a trust basis. I really can't stress that enough. It's so important to have trust in what we're doing, and that's why the people that have still survived, our last 3 subcontractors, they are the best guys from the start and until now. Both of them worked for us for more than 14 years, and the other person has been a supplier since Desco actually started. So those are the kind of people that you want to help. And then just to run through the benefits of what it's helped to Desco is that there's been a much quicker turnaround in terms of how quickly we actually process the e-waste, because it takes up a lot of space, and that's been helpful to us. The less staff on site has also been a benefit, because we had a lot of people that were essentially walking around, because labor is less expensive than everywhere else in the world, but it's still inconvenient to have people essentially walking around. There's obviously an addition of free space, and then for them, there's an addition of creating jobs, which is nice. I spoke about empowering businesses. That counts to our BEE scorecard, which is good for government tenders. And the willingness of them to essentially travel to provinces on our behalf to service our own client base helps us a great deal. So there is a lot of give and take with the relationship that we have with these subcontractors. But when there is an issue, we obviously issue them with a first warning. We do learn as we go. So every single time there is, like, let's say, a finding, we try and set up a rule on paper, a contract or an annexure to their contracts. And we say, look, you can't do this anymore. We try and teach them, we try and get over it. And the next time we have to add an additional informal recycler that we want to make formalized, we at least have a structure in place to immediately apply. But it's still an ongoing project, because something that I need to further speak to Daniel about is we've just invested in a property that's quite close by, and it's easier to monitor whether they are dumping or not. It's easier to keep a close eye on them, but it also saves us transport costs. It saves us yeah, it saves us a lot of fees. So that's great now. And the benefits of that is that we're also giving, well, benefits to them is that we're giving them free rent. They don't pay rent at all, but then now the deal is that they have to sell all the commodities to us. So it's a give and take that we're working on here. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have officially only 5 minutes left for the discussion, but I would suggest we're taking up now again the slide that Daniel presented at the end and start the discussion. I record anyways the discussion also, so I will share with you after the webinar also all the slides. So in case you have to drop off because you have to run to another meeting, then you will still be able to follow the discussion. And also you can then, I will post the questions again in the follow-up email, so you can also just react in a written form. Daniel, do you also want to introduce again a bit the questions, and then we can open up for everyone to answer probably.
Yeah, maybe there are some questions in the chat which you could already ask. I think Daniel, Ott, there was a question to you, but I can't see the chat anymore.
Do you guys want me to answer on that?
Yes, please, Daniel.
Okay.
Just go
So
ahead.
the question was, there's two questions from Marcos. There's a flow of we from informal recyclers to the second-hand market. How should public policies improve or formalize this? So in my opinion, at least for the Peruvian case, there's obviously also this kind of informal second-hand market versus the formal second-hand market. So there's a second-hand market that comes, with equipment from companies and let's say industry equipment where you where you have a refurbishment operation, and then you have a resale or a remarketing of these products. So that's kind of a formal second-hand market. And then obviously you have an informal second-hand market, which is part of the informal sector, but we sorry, I got distracted here for a second. So the focus, obviously, for most of the informal sector, at least in Peru, is not on reselling the equipment, but on recovering the fractions that are contained. So I guess that's also the more problematic activity, as we could say, than actually reselling the equipment. If they resell the equipment, that's probably a lot better than if they just recycle the material informally with the hazards that we have seen. So from a public policy point, I guess it's really difficult to formalize this. There is some intentions in Peru to reroute certain material that is going to the informal sector now through policies to a formal recycling, because there's a lot of corruption also around it. For example, public entities have to dispose of their e-waste through some kind of tender system, but then the tenders are cut short. There's informal sector jumping in front of the formal parties to get that material, or the material is gained by some shadow companies, and then it's rerouted to the informal sector. So there's a lot of things going on that where actually the informal sector is kind of always one step ahead of the formal guidelines that could be published. And on the second question, which is Peruvian legislation says that the producer of we must receive without cost we collected from their customers and generators in general. Is that helping the activities? I guess the answer definitely is yes. It is helping to get material, because e-waste recyclers, normally the formal e-waste recyclers at least, in order to actually be able to provide the service, they would at least have to cover the logistics cost for the pickup, or depending on the fractions that they're recycling, also part of the the recycling cost as such, because obviously we know that the material is sold in the informal sector, but with the formalization of the process, there are different costs coming into play, and formal recyclers nowadays, they're not able to pay for material. So that's where PROs like us, for example, come in, and the fact that generators have to or can hand over their material for free actually adds some benefit, because we can then cover the costs, let's say, that the recycler has, but the formal recycler can still receive the material, and so this material not necessarily is going to the informal sector. But obviously, if the informal sector is buying the material, then we're still competing against something that we basically can't compete with. Sorry for that long answer. I hope that explains more or less what the question was.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so Daniel also, the other Daniel, posted the questions here again, so we can all see the questions that he would like to discuss with you now. He also mentioned, and I think that's a very good thing also to mention again, so you can, if you have other questions or comments you want to share, you can just post them in the chat, or you can also just raise your hand and speak up. So maybe we can start with the first question, or Daniel, do you want to summarize again the background of your questions?
Sure. I mean, we've just heard from 3 case studies, and I'd really like to thank each of those presenters for sharing in detail what they're working on. And I can imagine it could be interesting. I don't know how much time everyone has to also have some questions on those if necessary, but we have the option. There are 2 other case studies, one from India and one from Ghana. We can also look at these in another webinar in the future. But we can also take a closer look at some specific elements from the paper. I don't know if incentive mechanisms or how to set up these kind of code of conducts or things like this could be interesting. I think probably we're also reliant on the case studies themselves to share a lot more on how they do this. I think this would be interesting to know if the feedback from the group, would you be interested in presenting more initiatives, ideas, projects that are not in the paper? Maybe the easiest way to come back on this directly is in the chat, just to write some comments in there if you have ideas or feedback on this. The same applies to other examples of different partnerships. We only were able to pick up the partnerships which we knew of through our networks, and I'm sure that there are other things going on which maybe other people on the call know about, and it would be really interesting to pick up more examples for this. And I mean, ultimately, the idea behind this, we support more of these partnerships to become, fruitful, let's say. So I think also the idea of how we can support this on the ground in different countries to come into local legislation initiatives would be interesting to hear any comments or feedback on this. Depending on time, I mean, it's now just come to the end of the 1.5 hours.
Yes, so I would suggest we pick up if there are, so we keep on the call for another 10 to 15 minutes, so just to catch the most important points, so what people want to share. So and then if you could not share what you wanted to share in the call, you can just send it in also via email. So I think also, Marcus, you mentioned already before another initiative in Brazil. So I don't know if you would feel comfortable to just take up also the word and explain a bit what's going on in Brazil, and also post your question then directly, to Daniel or to whom you want to address it.
Hi, Elizabeth. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Marcus.
Okay, good. So, yeah, I was just mentioning before some of the initiatives we have. I have developed a digital ecosystem, which is basically tracking algorithm. So we have developed a traceability algorithm, and on the top of that, we have developed a ERP. So it's a operation software for electronics recyclers. So we manage the logistics, the entrance of the products, also the recycling and the refurbishment as well. So we make those softwares free for the recyclers. So any recycler interested in using the software, they can get into the system, and then we develop a network of small recyclers using the same software. So one customer can request a pickup anywhere in the country here in Brazil, but also we are developing a more Latin America strategy. So a customer can request a collection, and all the collections will be follow the same flow. So the customer, independently what recycler is processing the material, they have exactly the same information in one portal. So the customer has access to the portal and can request collections and follow all the process through the system. But I can also send some information additionally here. So, but the question I had, I think it's pretty open. I have written here in the chat as well, which is, I feel that most of the times the biggest challenge to partnership with the informal sector is the requirements, the compliance requirements from actually the manufacturers, the producers. Here in Brazil, it's pretty challenging because they don't want to use most of the scavengers, which are going around collecting the e-waste most of the time. So we are not using them because the requirements are very strict. You know, if the company are certified on the ISO 14001, 9001, 40,001, 45,000, and also R2 sometimes. So so my question is, how can we still use the informal sector but comply with the strict requirements from the manufacturer? So how you have, if the speakers are comfortable to say, but how you manage that as well? You know, use informal sector into the EPR, formal EPR systems, but also still comply with all the compliance requirements.
Thank you, Marcus, for this interesting question. I think it's it's really a good one. So would one of the speakers be comfortable, or anyone else from the participants have an idea or have a comment on that?
I do, Daniel here. But
Yes, please.
so I guess basically the case that we presented is one of the solutions to that, because as a producer responsibility organization, we're obviously, you know, we have to implement our member company standards when it comes down to recycling. On the other hand, we can't really integrate informal recycling into the system as such, but we can integrate informal collection. So that's why we really focused on collecting the material through a formal informal interface, like it is the case of Emaús Trujillo. And once the material has been collected by them and is, you know, not going back to the informal sector, then all the control mechanisms that we have in place, they actually apply. So from the point of, let's say, aggregation from their storage centers, when everything is ready for pickup from our end, from that moment on, we have full transparency, full traceability. We're trying to work this, you know, further up the chain so that we could actually have the full traceability down to the generator of the material. That has been quite a challenge, because as more regulations or more requirements we push on Emaús, the more likely they are to back off or to think that this whole system is too complicated. So we had to live with a certain middle way, let's say. But at least from the point where we take over the material, we know exactly how everything then is managed on the downstream. And I think that's really valuable. But we're only capable of involving them into collection and not into treatment or recycling as such.
Elizabeth, if I could just add to that, I agree with what Daniel said, but sometimes what we also do is we can set up like a joint venture where the informal recycler, when he becomes formal, he can source the material, bring it to the DESCO site and prove to his customer that it's coming to a certified waste facility. And we actually allocate them spaces where they are allowed to dismantle their waste streams and then literally sell it to DESCO on their site, so that we can at least provide to whoever their customer is. This is at least DESCO standards. We have our waste license, we have our ISO certification, we have all our health and safety rules. So they are more than welcome to work on our premises, and that should at least help them bridge that barrier.
Thank you, Daniel and Julio, for this for this answer. Is there anyone else who wants to add something, or has maybe different experiences also in this regard? Okay, otherwise, are there some other questions, some other input someone wants to address now immediately to one of the speakers or to the whole group? Carlos, I see a question from you in the chat, so maybe that's then the last question that we will address now, and the other ones we will take up in a written form. So Carlos is asking, are there any requirements that the informal sector must meet when delivering the waste to the informal to the formal system? How, for example, not cannibalizing the residue? So probably this is also a question to all of the speakers. What would your experience be, maybe Adrian? And do you have some, could you answer the question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, certainly. I think when we talk about the informal sector, at least from my experience in Nigeria, it's obviously a very broad term. I mean, you have different levels within that sector, so some parts of it are more formal than others. But certainly any individuals that we work with, as I mentioned, are audited. So if they brought us a mobile phone board, we'd probably ask them, well, where's the rest of the phone? Where's the screen? So we do encourage them to bring the entire unit. And they would be incentivized appropriately for that. In my presentation, I mentioned it's not sustainable right now without any EPR systems in place, but nevertheless, that is the objective of any work we do with them. And certainly any EPR system that is implemented must address that issue. We cannot accept cherry picking, and we have to accept the hazardous fractions. Otherwise, we also then become informal as well, in my opinion. So yes, we do have requirements, and they are strict requirements. And as we keep mentioning, part of that is also on a trust system that they do bring us material that's in the correct format for us to accept.
Hi, this is Reinhard from Closing the Loop. Can I add something to this? Is it working?
Yes, of course, okay. Please.
I'm unmuted yet today, so yeah. So I just want to add to something that Adrian is saying. So we of course collect in various different African countries, and we collect mostly mobile phones. And the example Adrian gave of circuit boards coming without phones is a very key example, because the circuit boards of mobile phones are some of the most valuable, even though they're still negative. They're one of the most valuable components. So we incentivize bring the complete phone by paying more. But the main thing is that we're separating what we're paying and what it's worth completely from the material value of the stream. So whatever is in the phone that's being taken out by recyclers, whatever metals are in there, are not really matched by the collection. And this is of course also similar to the figures that Adrian was showing, the difference between the market prices and what actually you get paid for by the recyclers. So that's why what Daniel was also mentioning, new international financing mechanisms that make this possible. If you can separate that from the materials, then it makes a lot more possible, and then you're able to avoid cannibalizing completely, because it's no longer a matter of what's more valuable or what's less valuable. It's simply how much do people need to get paid in order to help collect things safely.
Daniel here. I'm also like to elaborate quickly on our point of view there. With our collaboration with MOs, for example, this is part of the agreement that we have to accept all of the material, even if it's cannibalized, and that doesn't bring us, for us as a PRO, tons are tons. We don't really care. If we have to fulfill compliance targets, we basically don't really care if it's just the shell or if it's the circuit boards in there as well. But obviously it makes a difference with the recycler. So sometimes we have the recycler, or we had the recycler pushing back about the fact that this material is really low value, and obviously some of it or part of it has been cannibalized before. So typically we have agreements that are based on the type of equipment and the type of value that is in the material. But for this material specifically, we've kind of gone back to a flat fee, because we think it's fair for the recycler as well, because sometimes the material just comes really cannibalized. So that has been kind of our work around it in that particular case.
Thank you for those inputs. Maybe just at the end, then is there also, Julio, how does it work in South Africa? So just that we have the complete picture.
I think it's very difficult to control what comes in, because the cell phone boards are very high value, but personally I've noticed the way it comes in is they only bring us the circuit boards. They'll bring us the shell, but we have no idea where the battery is, where the glass is, and we do ask them, and it's an unfortunate response where I don't know where it is. It's obviously an unacceptable response, but we can't control where they get their material from and how they are dumping it elsewhere. So in my experience, we haven't turned them away because they only give us half the product. We do accept what they have. If there is, like, for example, when they sell us CRTs or items with batteries in, we absolutely absorb that cost. We have no issue with doing that. But yeah, it's very difficult to control getting only half the product.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's also the last question was very interesting, and the answers to those. So yeah, because of time constraints, I think we need to wrap up now. So I would thank everyone for their contribution, especially the speakers for sharing their case studies. As mentioned before, I will share with you all the presentation and the recording of the webinar, and again address those questions that are still on the screen. And it would be very nice to get some feedback from all of you regarding your interest in follow-up webinars, because I think the management or cooperation with the informal sector is a very interesting topic, and there are always new aspects that should be addressed or can be shared with others, so to really have a good system in order to work together with the informal sector. And we are also discussing already how a next webinar could look like. So if you want to also be part of this process, just let us know and send in your especially the answers to those questions, and we would be happy to organize a webinar that would then address your interests. So thank you everyone for participating today. Thanks again to the speakers for sharing their information, and have a nice rest of the day, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone. Bye bye.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.